The morning an 80-year-old Mafia patriarch pointed across his clinic bed and announced to a room full of armed men that I was going to be his son's wife, I had been awake for 21 hours, and I was still holding the old man's hand because he had asked me to, like a child afraid of the dark. Everything that followed, the threats, the letters, the 20-year secret, began in that silence. The room went so quiet I could hear the oxygen concentrator breathing for him. 6 men in dark suits stood along the wall, the kind who never sat and never blinked first. At the door stood Anthony Bellomo, 53 years old, the most feared name in New Orleans, holding a paper bag of beignets like any son visiting his sick father. He looked at my hand inside his father's hand, and something crossed his face that I could not read. Giuseppe Bellomo was 80 years old, propped against white pillows, his heart monitor steady after a long night. 12 hours earlier he had been a stranger whose chart I had studied in a hallway. Now his eyes were open, clear, and absolutely certain. He raised one trembling finger, pointed it straight at me, and said, "Her. That is the woman my son should have as his wife." Nobody moved. I waited for the old man to laugh, or for the doctor to blame the medication. Neither happened. What happened instead was Anthony Bellomo setting the beignets down on the windowsill, turning to the wall of suits, and saying one quiet word, "Out." They obeyed so fast the door barely had time to close behind them. Then Anthony did something I did not expect from a man with his reputation. He apologized. "Miss Porter," he said, "my father has no authority over your life, your work, or your future. You owe this family nothing, and nobody in it will suggest otherwise." And still, neither of us could explain why a sane, calculating man would say such a thing about a woman he had met at midnight. What nobody knew, what I would not understand for weeks, was that the strangest part of that morning was not the declaration, it was the timing. Giuseppe Bellomo had already changed his plans for his son's future 3 days before he ever laid eyes on me. I finished my charting because that is who I am. My name is Nadine Porter. I am 38 years old, and for 15 years I have been the night patient coordinator at a private clinic in New Orleans, which is a polite way of saying I sit with people through the longest hours of their lives while the rest of the world sleeps. Now, before this story goes any further, if you have ever been the strong one, the reliable one, the person everyone leans on who never gets asked how she is doing, then this story is for you. Tap like and subscribe, because the next 3 months proved that being needed and being loved are 2 very different things. I became the reliable one early. My parents separated when I was 23. My father moved to Arizona, and my mother began needing help that never quite ended. My brother and sister built careers and families in other states. I stayed. Somebody had to sign the forms and drive to the appointments, and somehow that somebody was always me, until I stopped noticing the years. The one thing I did that belonged only to me was small and secret. Our parish runs a program called Letters of Hope. Volunteers write anonymously to isolated seniors, people who might not get another piece of mail all month. I had been writing those letters for years, under a code name nobody at the clinic knew. Remember that program. It is the key to everything Giuseppe did. The night it started was a Thursday in late September. My supervisor pulled me aside at shift change. A private patient was coming in for overnight observation. Wealthy, elderly, discreet, and the family was paying triple for their own coordinator. I almost said no. I was tired, and my mother had a dentist appointment in the morning. Triple Pay argued with me, and Triple Pay won. I asked who the Bellomos were. Casinos, hotels, private clubs. Half the port's friendship, she whispered. The father had run it all for 40 years and had been handing it to the son for the last 5. Whatever they pay, she said, earn it and come home. His file said Giuseppe Bellomo, 80, brief atrial rhythm disturbance, stable, held overnight as a precaution because of his age and cardiac history. Nothing in that file prepared me for the 4 men standing outside his door, or the way the hallway grew quieter around them. Inside the room, the patient himself was sitting up in bed with a rosary wrapped around his fist, wide awake and furious about it. "You can all go home," he told his men, in a voice that expected obedience. "Not you," he added, when I turned with them. "You are the night woman. Stay." It was not a request. I checked his vitals, adjusted his blanket, and told him the medication would help him sleep. "Medicine sleeps the body," he said. "It does not sleep the conscience." He asked me to sit while he prayed, and I did, because I have learned that prayer at 80 is rarely about the words. Then, without opening his eyes, he said something strange. "Tell me, Miss Porter, can a man confess a sin he is still committing?" The phrasing was odd, formal, almost rehearsed. I answered honestly that confessing a sin is usually the first step out of it. He opened his eyes and studied me a long moment. So I told him what I tell every frightened soul awake at 3 in the morning. "God may not restore yesterday," I said, "but he can stop yesterday from ruling tomorrow." His hand jerked so hard, the rosary beads clicked against the bed rail. I did not interrogate him. I did not preach. Sometime after 4, his breathing got ragged, and he admitted, without quite admitting it, that he was afraid of what he would dream. I took his hand and told him I would be there when he woke up. He fell asleep, still holding on. I fell asleep in the chair, and neither of us let go. The cars arrived at dawn, 6 of them, black and gleaming in the wet parking lot. I woke to voices in the hallway, untangled my hand as gently as I could, and was smoothing my wrinkled scrubs when Anthony Bellomo walked through the door with his father's breakfast. And that is when Giuseppe opened his eyes, looked at me like he had solved a problem that had been haunting him for years, and made his announcement. After Anthony cleared the room and apologized, he walked me to the elevator himself. He asked what had happened overnight, and there was an edge under the politeness, a man checking for a con. I told him the truth. His father had prayed, talked about sin, and held my hand. "That's all?" he said. "That's all," I said. He watched me the whole way down the hall, like I was a safe that might open if he stared long enough. As the elevator doors closed, I looked back down the long white hallway. Giuseppe was watching me through his open doorway. And here is the thing I could not shake then and cannot fully explain now. He did not look confused. He looked certain, the way a man looks when he has finally done something he decided to do a long, long time ago. I went home, slept 6 hours, and drove my mother to the dentist, because life does not stop for Mafia declarations. My sister called that night from Denver. When I told her, she laughed and said, "Well, at least someone finally proposed to you." I laughed too. That is what you do when you are the family joke. You laugh first, so it counts as your joke. Let me tell you properly about letters of hope. Every other Tuesday, I sat at a folding table in the parish hall basement. Our secretary, Miss Odette, matched writers to seniors and kept every identity sealed. The seniors wrote back through the parish box. Nobody knew anybody. That was the whole point. Nobody could be kind to you because of who you were, only because of what you said. For 18 months, my correspondent was a widower who signed his letters GB. He wrote beautifully, in a formal, old country style, about his late wife, about power, about how a man can spend 50 years being obeyed and wake up one morning unable to name a single person who truly chose him. "I protected someone I loved," he wrote, "until I took his choice away." I wrote back what I believed, that guilt is a compass, not a cage, that an arranged life is a stolen life, even when it is arranged with love, that God may not restore yesterday, but he can stop yesterday from ruling tomorrow. You see the problem now. I had been handing pieces of my soul to a stranger for a year and a half, with no idea the stranger could buy my whole clinic. 2 weeks after the declaration, Giuseppe returned for a follow-up, and his family requested me by name. Anthony was there, reading messages in the corner, looking like a man allergic to waiting rooms. I checked his blood pressure, asked the usual questions, and that is when Giuseppe, gazing out the window, said it. A man can protect someone he loves until he takes his choice away. That is the sin nobody confesses. My hands actually stopped on the blood pressure cuff. It was not similar to GB's letter. It was the letter, nearly word for word, spoken aloud in an examination room. Coincidence has a shape, and this was not it. I finished on autopilot, thinking that millionaire patriarchs do not usually write anonymous letters to a parish basement. But then, neither do night nurses. The next visit, I tested him. I mentioned that I volunteered with a parish letter program for seniors. Most people ask what it is. Giuseppe asked how the replies were matched, whether the writers ever learned the seniors' real names, and whether the letters passed through one office or several. He knew the machinery of a program he claimed to be hearing about for the first time. So I asked him directly, "Mr. Bellomo, are you GB?" He did not blink. He did not ask what GB meant, which was its own answer. He said, "Miss Porter, I am an old man in a paper gown. That is all I am today." An innocent man would have laughed. Giuseppe answered like a man protecting something he considered holy. I could not tell anyone. The program's whole promise was confidentiality, and I would not break it. Especially not to Anthony, who asked me in the parking garage that day what his father talked about with me. Respect, I said. Mostly respect. He told me that was a longer conversation than he had managed with his father in a month. Then Anthony said something that turned the whole mystery on its head. He told me his father had canceled the engagement dinner with Renata Savoy, the arranged marriage the two families had been circling for a year, 3 days before the night in my clinic. No warning, Anthony said. No reason given. My father simply told the Savoys there would be no dinner. The easy explanation was that I was a replacement, a warm body swapped into a vacancy, but the vacancy had been emptied before I existed in Giuseppe's world. Whatever reason he had for pointing at me that morning, it was already in motion before we met. Which raised a question that kept me awake worse than any night shift ever had. What had I done, without knowing it? A few days later, Anthony called the clinic, not the agency, the clinic, and asked if I would continue coordinating his father's care personally. He offered an absurd amount of money. I told him the schedule was the schedule, and money did not change it. There was a pause, then something that sounded almost like a laugh. "You know," he said, "you are the first person in this city who has told me no, twice in 1 month." The Savoys were an old New Orleans family whose hotels and restaurants overlapped with Bellomo interests. The elders of both families had decided that Anthony, 53 and never married, and Renata Savoy, 46 and never married, should merge the families the old way. Nobody asked either of them. Anthony told me all of this standing under the clinic awning in the rain, his driver holding the car and his patients. "Why are you telling me any of this?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because my father pointed at you," he said. "And my father never does anything without a reason. I want to know his reason before it costs someone." Even the son assumed the declaration was a move in some game. I kept remembering his face when I said my sentence about yesterday and tomorrow. That had not been strategy. That had been recognition. Somewhere between my parish basement and his hospital bed, something had connected, and I was starting to suspect the wire ran through my own letters. That Friday, a new letter from GB waited for me at the parish. He wrote that he had recently done something impulsive, something an old version of himself would have called decisive. "I have tried to give back something I once stole," he wrote, "and I fear I have only stolen it again in a different wrapping. I sat in that basement for a long time, the letters shaking in my hands." The letters and the man were converging like two trains on one track. GB wrote about a son who had stopped trusting love 20 years ago. Anthony had the closed, careful stillness of a man who had built his whole life around exactly such a wound. And Giuseppe. Giuseppe watched his son, the way you watch a house you once set on fire, grateful it still stands, and unable to forget the matches. Meanwhile, my mother, Marianne, was doing fine, 2 years into her senior community, busy with her garden club, needing me less every month. I should have been relieved. Instead, I sat in my quiet apartment and realized I did not know what a Nadine who was not needed was supposed to do with a Tuesday. Nobody had taught me how to become free. And then there was Anthony, who kept finding reasons to attend his father's appointments himself instead of sending lieutenants. He held doors. He brought his father's favorite chicory coffee and, twice, a second cup that was exactly how I take mine. I told myself it was observation, a careful man watching a stranger near his father. But careful men do not remember how you take your coffee. 3 weeks after the declaration came the parish fish fry, the big fundraiser that paid for letters of hope postage and half the senior bus. Anthony Bellomo was standing in our parish hall in a suit that cost more than the friar, holding a check with enough zeros to buy a new bus. Every eye went to me. By then, half the parish had heard a garbled version of the clinic story. Anthony made a small, graceful speech about community and handed me the check in front of everyone. It was also a solution he could buy instead of be. I told the truth in public, politely, at my own expense. "Mr. Bellomo, this is kind, and the bus fund thanks you," I said. "But this program does not run on money. It runs on people who show up every week and give a lonely stranger an hour of their actual life. We have plenty of donors. What we are short on is Tuesdays." The hall held its breath. Then Anthony folded the check back into his pocket, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "When is your next Tuesday?" He came. No cameras, no men. Well, one man, parked outside, because some habits are armor. Anthony Bellomo sat at my folding table for 2 hours reading letters from strangers, and I watched him with a 79-year-old widow's handwriting, patient as stone, and I saw the man underneath the name for the first time. He was not cold, he was careful. There is a difference, and the difference is usually grief. Afterwards, stacking chairs, he said, "You were right. It is easier to sign a check than to sit still." It was the closest thing to a confession I had heard from him. He asked how I had learned it, and I said, "By being useful for a living." He just nodded slowly, like I had handed him a translation of something spoken in his own house. Then came the meeting I had been dreading. Anthony arranged it, because Renata Savoy deserved to be heard, and I deserved to stop imagining her. We met at her family's restaurant after closing. She was 46, composed as a judge, and she shook my hand like an equal. I had expected a rival. I had prepared for frost. Renata looked at Anthony and said, "Shall I tell her, or will you?" Then she turned to me. "Miss Porter, I never wanted to marry him. No offense, Anthony." "None taken," he said, and I realized they were old allies of a kind, 2 people who had been discussed like real estate for a year. "Our families were insuring cargo," Renata said. "They called it a marriage because insurance sounds cold at Sunday dinner." I asked why she had gone along with it. "When you are an unmarried woman past 40 in our world, people stop seeing a person and start seeing an unused asset. I was negotiating for the one thing nobody thought to offer me, a say in my own life." She smiled then, thin and real. "Your old man blew that up before you ever met him." "He is not my old man," I said. "He is everybody's problem," Renata answered. "But he is your mystery." "The Savoy elders," she said, "were furious about the cancelled dinner, and more furious that Giuseppe gave no reason. Men like Giuseppe do not act without reasons," she said. "Find his reason, Miss Porter, before his reason finds you." Autumn settled in, the season when the New Orleans heat finally loosens its fist and things you have been too busy to feel make themselves known. Mine arrived quietly, in small humiliations. I realized I had no opinion about what restaurant I liked, because I had not chosen a restaurant for pleasure in years. My calendar was full of everyone else's emergencies and empty of anything I had simply wanted. And Giuseppe kept leaving his lanterns. At the October appointment, describing a man who had ruled a family for 40 years, he said, "An arranged life is a stolen life, Miss Porter, even when the thief means well." Those were my words, not approximately, mine, from a letter I had written in March, nearly exact. I looked up from his chart, and he was watching my face, calm as a priest, waiting to see if I would finally knock. Instead, I asked about his wife. 7 years gone, and he still straightened his wedding band, saying her name. He spoke of her gently. 51 years, he said, and he had decided everything for her, the house, the city, the doctors, and called it love. She forgave me for it, because she was kind, he said. Kindness, I have learned, is not the same as permission. His eyes were wet. Behind that sentence, I could hear 20 years of something he would not name. That night, I laid the evidence out on my kitchen table like a detective in a film. The phrases, the timing, the canceled dinner, the letter about stealing something twice. Every road ended at the same address. Giuseppe Bellomo was GB. He had known me, in the deepest way two strangers can know each other, for 18 months before I ever took his pulse. And he had pointed at me and said, "Wife." Here is where I need to ask you something, because I still argue with myself about it. I had proof enough to confront a powerful, fragile old man, but confronting him meant admitting I was the letter writer, breaking the anonymity that was the whole promise of the program. Was I right to protect the secret a little longer, or was that just fear wearing a Sunday dress? Tell me in the comments what you would have done. In the end, the decision was made for me, by a hurricane of all things. A Gulf storm knocked the power out across half the parish the first week of November, and the clinic ran on generators and nerves. Giuseppe's appointment was moved up. When I walked into his room that gray morning, he sat by the dark window holding a letter I recognized by the parish envelope. "I think it is time, Miss Porter," he said. I sat down across from him, and I did not make him say it first, because he was 80 and I had made him wait long enough. "Hello, GB," I said. He closed his eyes, and his whole face changed, 18 months of secrecy leaving it like weather passing. "Hello, Nadine," he answered, my real first name, which no senior in the program was ever supposed to know. "I wondered how long it would take you. Your letters are braver than you are." He told me everything in order. He had written to the program for over a year as a lonely widower, and my answers had worked on him like water on stone. And that first night in the clinic, when I said, half asleep, that God may not restore yesterday, but he can stop yesterday from ruling tomorrow, his own correspondent's sentence, coming out of his night nurse's mouth, he knew. "You understand," he said. "I had already cancelled the Savoy dinner because of you." "Because of my letters," I corrected. "There is a difference." "Yes," he said, and smiled sadly. "Your letters taught an old man that arranging his son's marriage was a sin dressed as duty." And then the woman who taught him walked into his room and held his hand like it was worth holding. His voice broke on the last part. "I looked at you and I thought, this is the kind of woman my son should have had all along." It was not madness. It was not strategy. It was an old man trying to hand back something he believed he had stolen, using the only tool he had ever owned, which was deciding things for people. My heart was pounding, because if that was true, then the sentence in his letters was not poetry. "Giuseppe," I said quietly, "what did you do to your son?" The generator hum filled the room. Outside, the first hard rain hit the windows. Giuseppe looked at his hands, the hands that had run a family for 40 years, the hands I had held all night, and when he finally spoke, his voice was very small. 20 years ago, he said, there was a woman named Celia Marchand, and I decided she was not enough for us. God forgive me, my son never knew. Celia Marchand. He said the name like a man unlocking a room he had not entered in 20 years. She had been 31, from a respectable New Orleans family. Respectable, but not mafia, not connected, not useful. Anthony had been 33, and serious about her in a way he had never been serious about anything. He was going to marry her, Giuseppe said. He told me at Sunday dinner, and I watched my whole plan for him walk out the door in a summer dress. He did not forbid anything. Forbidding would have made Anthony dig in. Instead, he went to Celia privately, and he lied with the skill of a man who had made lying look like wisdom for 40 years. He told her Anthony had already chosen the family over her, that staying would start a war between father and son that she would spend her life paying for. He made leaving sound like love. And to Anthony, he said nothing at all. He simply let his son believe that Celia had weighed him against a job offer in Atlanta and found him wanting. She stopped answering Anthony's calls because she believed he had chosen. He stopped calling because he believed she had left. Two people who loved each other, each thought the other had walked away, and the only person who knew the whole truth stood between them, calling it protection. She took the job, Giuseppe whispered. She built a good life. I checked, over the years, like a thief checking on a house he robbed. Married late. A daughter. But my son, he stopped. My son decided that day that people choose their own interests over him, always, and he has spent 20 years proving he needs no one. I did that, with love. God help me with love. I sat with the weight of it. His declaration over his sickbed was not a new sin, it was the same sin, repeated. 20 years ago he had chosen who his son could not love. Now, repenting, he had chosen who his son should. He had confessed the crime and committed it again, and he could not see it, because in his hands, the tool and the love were the same thing. So I told him, as gently as I could, and as plainly as he needed, Giuseppe, repentance does not mean picking a better woman for Anthony. It means surrendering the right to pick anyone. You cannot fix a stolen choice by stealing another one. Not even for me. Especially not for me. He stared at me for a long time. Then this man, who had been obeyed for 40 years, nodded slowly and said, "Then tell me what surrender looks like." "I have never seen it." I told him it looked like the truth, in front of the same people who had heard the declaration. No excuse, no rewrite, no quiet burial. And it looked like telling Anthony, all of it, Celia included, without asking for forgiveness in return. Giuseppe went very still. "He will hate me," he said. "Maybe," I answered. "But he has been living inside your lie for 20 years. Men can survive the truth. It is the lie that eats them." The Bellamo Council met the following week, in a private dining room above one of their clubs, and I was there because I insisted on it. Portraits of dead men lined the walls. Down one side, the Bellomo elders. Down the other, the Savoys, Renata among them, who caught my eye and gave me the smallest nod. They had gathered expecting a wedding to be salvaged. They were about to get an autopsy instead. Giuseppe stood, refused his cane, I noticed, and addressed the men who had heard him name me in the clinic. "I told you this woman would be my son's wife," he said. "I had no right. I have spent my life confusing authority with love, and that morning I did it again, in front of all of you. There is no arrangement. There never was. Whatever comes next in Miss Porter's life belongs to Miss Porter, and not to this family." Then one of the older cousins, a man named Salvatore, all eyebrows and old grievances, leaned forward and said what they were all thinking. "Fine." Then the Savoy marriage proceeds as planned. The girl was a mistake, we forget her, and the families do business. And every face turned to me, the mistake, waiting to see if I would slip out quietly, the way mistakes do. I did not slip. "You can forget me," I said, "but you cannot unsay what this morning meant. And hear me clearly, all of you, so no one rewrites it later. Mr. Belomo's apology is not permission for his son to court me. I am not a door that opened because an old man knocked. I belong to no arrangement, past, present, or future. Renata was smiling behind her coffee cup. Anthony was looking at me like I had just done something rare. Renata set the cup down and stood. Since truths are fashionable today, here is mine. I do not want this marriage. I never did, and the Savoys do not need to sell a daughter to keep a dock contract. The room erupted. Old men talking over each other about 40 years of cooperation and stability. Salvatore actually said the word weakness, loudly, in Anthony's direction. Anthony let the noise run until it tired itself out. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and spoke in the quiet voice I had learned to recognize as his most dangerous. Here is the choice, gentlemen, and it is a real one. We can keep buying peace with people's lives, or we can do business like businessmen. I am offering the Savoys a direct partnership on the port contracts, transparent terms, equal signatures, no bride included. Take it, or take your alliances elsewhere. 3 of the oldest allies walked out. 2 took contracts with them, and there were lean, tense months after, the family whispering the boss had gone soft over a nurse. He absorbed all of it. He never once pointed that cost at me. That is when I understood what kind of man I was falling for. Renata took the deal, by the way. She negotiated it against Anthony for 6 weeks and got terms her uncles had failed to get in 40 years of marriage talk. Months later, at Christmas Mass, she squeezed my arm and said, "Turns out, I was worth more as a signature than a bride." But that came later. That night, after the room emptied, Giuseppe asked Anthony and me to stay. I will not repeat the whole of what Giuseppe told his son that night. Some of it belongs to Anthony, and always will. But I watched a 53-year-old man learn that the defining heartbreak of his life had been stage-managed by his own father, and I watched him go very still, the way deep water goes still. He did not shout. That would have been easier. He said, 20 years, Pop. You let me grieve a choice she never made." Giuseppe gave no excuse. He did not say the times were different or that he had meant well. None of the small coins the guilty pay with. He said, "I was wrong. I cannot give the years back. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight. I am asking you to know." Anthony stood there a long time, then said the truest thing I ever heard him say. "If we are going to stay father and son, no more decisions for me. Not ever. Not even the kind ones." Healing did not arrive in one conversation, the way it does in movies. Anthony kept coming to Sunday dinner, but now he came because he chose to, and some Sundays he chose not to, and Giuseppe let him. That was new, the letting. I would stop by and find the 2 of them arguing about football instead of destiny, and Giuseppe would catch my eye over his son's shoulder with the look of a man paying a debt on time. As for me, I started practicing wanting things, small ones first. I took a Wednesday evening pottery class and was spectacularly bad at it, and nobody needed me to be good, which was the entire point. I stopped taking every extra shift. When my sister made her usual joke at Thanksgiving, "Nadine finally got a life," I did not laugh it off. I said, "Yes. About time, isn't it?" And then, one ordinary evening in February, nearly 4 months after the council, I was at the parish hall sorting letters of hope replies when I heard footsteps that I had somehow learned to recognize. Anthony, alone. No driver, no flowers, no audience. He stood in the doorway of that fluorescent basement, the most feared man in the city, looking almost shy, and he said, "Nadine, I would like to take you to dinner. An ordinary dinner, no agreement attached. You can say no. I want you to understand exactly why I cried a little, right there over the mail. It was not the asking. Men had asked before. It was that sentence, you can say no, from a man whose whole world was built on people being unable to say it. Nobody had chosen this for us. For the first time in my adult life, nobody needed me to do anything. I was simply being asked. I said yes, because I wanted to. It took me 38 years to earn the right to say it. We went to a little place on Magazine Street, and Anthony Bellomo, who could buy the building, spent the whole evening asking about my pottery failures and laughing, really laughing, and I thought, so this is what it feels like to be chosen instead of used. A week later, Giuseppe received a final envelope through the parish program. Inside was a single page, unsigned, in handwriting he knew better than his own. It said, "God corrected nothing for us. He gave us the chance to correct what we could. He keeps it in his rosary box. He cannot give Anthony back 20 years. I cannot get back my 30s. Yesterday is not the boss of this family." If this story found something in you, if you have ever been the dependable one, the strong one, the one who forgot to have a life of her own, then like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, was Giuseppe's apology enough, or does some damage just take longer than forgiveness? Anthony and I are taking it one ordinary dinner at a time. And for the first time ever, ordinary feels like everything.